The command center buzzed with controlled chaos as holographic displays flickered with incoming data from the front lines. Commander of the Galactic Coalition forces stood tall, her crystalline skin reflecting the amber warning lights that pulsed throughout the massive war room. Around her, representatives from 17 different species coordinated the defense of the Outer Rim territories against the Swarm, a race that had been pushing into coalition space for the past 3 cycles. The war had been going well, or so everyone believed. The coalition followed the Accords of Civilized Warfare, a set of rules established thousands of years ago that governed conflict between spacefaring species. No weapons of mass destruction, no targeting of civilian populations, no biological warfare. Every species that joined the galactic community agreed to these terms, and wars were fought with honor and restraint. The Swarm had agreed to these same accords when they first made contact 2 decades ago. Their diplomats, speaking through translation devices, had seemed eager to join the galactic community. But 3 cycles ago, something changed. The bugs, as the soldiers had taken to calling them, began expanding aggressively into coalition territory. Watch the tactical display as another colony world fell to the Swarm. The evacuation had been orderly, the civilian transports escaping before the bugs arrived. The coalition fleet had engaged according to standard protocols, fighting ship to ship, avoiding planetary bombardment. They had retreated when losses reached acceptable thresholds, preserving their forces for the next engagement. This was how civilized species fought wars. A young officer from the species approached, his tentacles quivering with barely contained stress. "Commander, the vortex system has fallen. All military assets have been withdrawn. Civilian casualties were minimal." Nodded, trying to ignore the hollow feeling in her chest. Minimal casualties. They kept using that phrase as if losing entire worlds was acceptable as long as most people escaped. But where would they retreat to next? The Swarm seemed endless, their ships multiplying faster than the coalition could destroy them. "Commander," another voice called out. This one belonged to General Thrax, a battle-hardened whose species had fought in dozens of conflicts. His 4 eyes all focused on with concern. "We need to discuss bringing in additional resources. The Council has approved seeking assistance from outside sources." Felt her skin shift to a pale blue, indicating confusion. "Outside sources? General, we've already mobilized every fleet in the coalition." Thrax's mandibles clicked together, a sign of discomfort in his species. "Not every fleet, Commander. There is one species we haven't approached, one that maintains a military but rarely engages in galactic affairs." The name hung in the air before he spoke it, and felt a chill run through her crystalline form. The humans. Silence spread through the command center like a wave. Everyone knew of humanity. They were a relatively young species, having achieved faster-than-light travel only 400 years ago. They had been welcomed into the galactic community, had signed the accords, had established trade relationships and diplomatic ties. But they remained distant, keeping to their own corner of space, their own colonies, their own affairs. What most species whispered about, usually late at night over drinks, was humanity's history. Before they reached the stars, humans had fought among themselves with a brutality that shocked the civilized galaxy. They had weapons that could crack planets, diseases engineered to kill billions, and a seemingly endless capacity for violence against their own kind. When they joined the coalition, they had agreed to abandon such methods and embrace civilized warfare. But the question many asked was whether humans could truly change their nature, or if they simply suppressed it. "General Thrax said carefully, "Humans have been model citizens of the coalition. They follow the accords. They've never given us reason to doubt their commitment to civilized warfare." "I know," Thrax replied, "but their military history suggests they have experience with total war, with enemies that don't follow rules. Perhaps they can offer strategic insights we lack." Considered this. The coalition was losing ground every day. They needed something to change, some new approach. Perhaps the humans, with their unusual perspective, could provide that edge. It seemed harmless enough to ask for consultation. "Very well," she said. "Send a formal request to the Human Systems Alliance. Ask for military advisors to consult on our strategy against the Swarm." The message was sent through official diplomatic channels. To everyone's surprise, the humans responded within hours. They would send a delegation, led by a military consultant named. He would arrive at the Coalition command station within 2 standard days. When stepped off the human transport, he wasn't what anyone expected. He was old by human standards, well into his 70s, with gray hair and a weathered face lined with scars. He walked with a slight limp and carried a simple duffel bag over his shoulder. He wore a plain uniform with no decorations, no medals, nothing to indicate his rank or achievements. Commander greeted him personally in the docking bay, flanked by General Thrax and several other senior officers. She extended her hand in the human gesture of greeting she had learned. "Consultant, welcome to Coalition Command. We appreciate your willingness to assist us." Shook her hand firmly, his grip stronger than his age suggested. When he spoke, his voice was rough, like stone grinding against stone. "Just is fine, Commander, and I'm here because when someone asks for help against bugs that don't quit, you answer that call." There was something in his eyes, a hardness that made uncomfortable. She had seen many soldiers, veterans of countless battles, but none had looked at her quite like this. It wasn't hostility exactly, but something older, something tired and resigned. "We've prepared quarters for you and briefing materials on the current situation," said, leading him through the station's corridors. "Our war with the swarm has been ongoing for 3 cycles now. They're in species, highly organized, with rapid reproduction rates." "How many worlds have you lost?" asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. Hesitated. 17 colonies, 12 mining stations, and 6 agricultural worlds, but casualties have been minimal. We evacuate before each engagement. Stopped walking. He turned to look at her fully and for a moment saw something in his expression that she couldn't quite identify. Pity, perhaps, or was it disappointment? "Minimal casualties," he repeated slowly. "You've lost 35 worlds and you're calling the casualties minimal. How many military personnel have you lost?" "Approximately 40,000 across all engagements," General Thrax answered. "A regrettable but acceptable number given the scale of the conflict." Was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, almost sad. "Take me to the war room. I need to see your tactical data, your engagement records, everything." For the next 6 hours, sat in the war room, studying displays, reading reports, and watching recordings of battles. The coalition officers who were present said he barely moved, barely blinked. He just watched with those hard eyes, occasionally making notes on a data pad. When he finally stood up, every officer in the room turned to him, waiting for his analysis, his brilliant strategic insight that would turn the tide of the war. Instead, looked at them and asked a single question: "Do you want to win this war?" Felt her skin flush with irritation, shifting to an orange hue. "Of course we want to win, that's why you're here." "No," said firmly. "You want to fight this war, there's a difference. You want to engage the enemy, trade blows, maybe push them back a bit, but winning, actually defeating them, that's something else entirely." General Thrax stepped forward, his mandibles clicking in agitation. "Consultant, I don't think you understand the nature of civilized warfare. We follow the accords. We don't commit atrocities. We don't become monsters to defeat monsters." Looked at the general for a long time before responding. When he did, his voice carried a weight that silenced the entire room. "General, I've read your accords, I've studied your rules of engagement, and I've watched your battle recordings. You know what I see? I see an enemy that's eating you alive while you follow rules they're exploiting. The swarm isn't fighting a civilized war. They're fighting to survive, to expand, to consume. And you're letting them win because you're afraid of what you might become if you actually fought back." What? The room erupted in protests, officers from a dozen species shouting their objections. But raised his hand, and somehow, impossibly, they fell silent. "Let me tell you what's going to happen," said, his voice cutting through the room like a knife. "The bugs will keep pushing, you'll keep retreating. You'll keep evacuating worlds, keep preserving your forces, keep following your rules. And eventually you'll run out of places to retreat to. You'll lose your core worlds, your home planets, and then you'll have a choice. Break your precious accords or become extinct." Felt cold despite the warm atmosphere of the command center. "What are you suggesting?" Pulled out a data chip from his pocket and placed it on the central console. "I'm suggesting you look at human military history, not the sanitized version we showed the Council when we joined. The real history. The wars we fought before we reached the stars. The wars where we had to make hard choices to survive." "We know your history," Thrax said stiffly. "Your species nearly destroyed itself multiple times." "Yeah, we did," agreed. "We were stupid, wasteful, and cruel to each other, but we learned something from all that bloodshed. We learned how to fight enemies that don't quit, that don't negotiate, that don't care about rules or honor or mercy. We learned how to win when the alternative was extinction. He activated the data chip, and images filled the holographic displays. Battles from Earth's history, conflicts fought with brutal efficiency. The officers watched in horrified fascination as humans employed tactics and strategies that violated every principle of civilized warfare. You see, continued, humans have fought enemies like your swarm before, not in space but on our home world. Enemies that bred fast, that coordinated through biological imperatives, that saw us as nothing more than resources to be consumed. We called them different things, locusts, ants, wasps, and we learned that fighting them with honor and restraint didn't work. They didn't care about our rules, they only understood survival. A young officer from the species, barely out of the academy, spoke up timidly. "What did you do?" Turned to face her and his expression softened slightly. "We adapted. We used chemical weapons, biological agents, environmental manipulation. We scorched earth, poisoned water, destroyed ecosystems. We did terrible things, and we won." The horror on every face in the room was palpable. Felt her skin turn a deep purple, the color of disgust in her species. "You're suggesting we commit genocide, that we abandon everything that makes us civilized." "No," said sharply. "I'm suggesting you recognize what kind of war you're actually fighting. The swarm isn't going to stop because you ask nicely. They're not going to respect your accords. They're going to keep coming until they've consumed everything, or until you stop them permanently." He walked to the tactical display and pointed at the latest swarm incursion. "Look at their expansion pattern. They're not interested in coexistence. They're not even interested in conquest in any traditional sense. They're consuming resources, reproducing, and moving on. Your civilized warfare is meaningless to them because they're not civilized. They're locusts in space." General Thrax's 4 eyes narrowed. "And your solution is to become like them, to abandon our principles." Shook his head slowly. "My solution is to survive. Principles are wonderful things, General. They're what separate us from animals, what let us sleep at night, what make civilizations possible. But they're worth nothing if you're dead. The swarm doesn't care about your principles. They care about eating, breeding, and spreading. And unless you're willing to do what's necessary to stop them, they're going to turn your civilized galaxy into a breeding ground." Silence fell over the war room. Every officer present was grappling with the implications of what was suggesting. They had spent their entire lives believing in the accords, in civilized warfare, in the idea that there was a right way to fight. Now this old human was telling them it was all meaningless against an enemy that didn't share their values. Commander felt a headache forming behind her optical sensors. "Consultant, what you're suggesting would require council approval. We can't simply abandon the accords on the word of one advisor." "I know," said. "I'm not expecting you to change your entire military doctrine overnight, but I am asking you to consider the possibility that your current approach isn't working. You've lost 35 worlds in 3 cycles. How many more are you willing to lose before you admit that something needs to change?" He collected his data chip and headed toward the door. Before leaving, he turned back one more time. "I'll be in my quarters if you need me, but Commander, make this decision fast. Because while we're talking about principles and rules, the bugs are eating another one of your worlds." After left, the war room remained silent for several minutes. Finally, General Thrax spoke, his voice heavy with uncertainty. "He's wrong. He has to be wrong. We've built a galactic civilization on the foundation of civilized warfare. We can't just throw that away." But even as he said it, could hear the doubt in his voice. They all felt it, the nagging suspicion that maybe, just maybe, the old human was right. Maybe they were losing because they were fighting the wrong kind of war. Made a decision. "General, convene an emergency council session. We need to discuss this with the full leadership. And get me everything we have on human military history, the uncensored version. If we're going to consider changing our approach, I want to know exactly what we're getting ourselves into." Over the next day, the Coalition Council reviewed classified files on human warfare. What they found shocked them to their cores. Humans had fought wars that made their current conflict with the swarm look like a minor skirmish. They had developed weapons capable of ending all life on a planet. They had created diseases that killed with horrifying efficiency. They had bombed cities, starved populations, and done things that no civilized species would even contemplate. But they had also survived. They had faced enemies that wanted nothing less than their total extinction, and they had found ways to win. Not with honor, not with grace, but with raw, brutal determination. The council session was the most heated in recent memory. Some members wanted to send home immediately, to forget his suggestions and continue fighting as they always had. Others argued that perhaps the humans had learned something valuable from their violent past, something that could save them now. Commander found herself in an uncomfortable middle ground. She didn't want to become what the humans had been, but she also didn't want to watch her civilization slowly die because they were too proud to adapt. The debate raged for hours until finally, the council reached a compromise. They would allow to develop an alternative strategy, one that pushed the boundaries of the Accords but didn't stood before the holographic map of the frontier sector, his weathered hands clasped behind his back. Around him, 24 coalition officers watched with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. They had gathered in the tactical planning room of the Forward Command Station, a massive facility orbiting the mining world of Seven, one of the last coalition holdings before swarm territory. "Tell me about Seven," said without looking away from the display. Captain, a officer with silver feathers and 4 arms, stepped forward. "It's a deuterium mining facility. Population of approximately 50,000 workers, mostly automated systems. Strategic value is moderate. We've been preparing evacuation protocols in case the swarm advances this far." Finally turned to face them. "Cancel the evacuation." The room erupted in protest but raised a hand. "I'm not suggesting we sacrifice civilians. I'm suggesting we use them as bait with their knowledge and consent. Here's what I need you to understand. The swarm has been winning because they know exactly what you're going to do. You evacuate, you engage in space, you retreat when losses reach a threshold. They've adapted to your predictability, so we're going to give them something unpredictable." Commander, who had traveled to the forward station specifically for this briefing, felt her skin shift to a concerned yellow. "Consultant, using civilians as bait violates multiple sections of the Accords." "Does it?" Pulled up a section of the Accords on a side display. Section 7, subsection 4. Civilian populations may remain in contested zones if adequate protection is provided and evacuation is logistically impractical. Section 9, subsection 2. Military forces may operate in proximity to civilian populations if separation would compromise defensive capabilities. The Accords have loopholes, Commander. The swarm has been exploiting them. It's time we did the same. General Thrax, who had also made the journey to observe, clicked his mandibles thoughtfully. "What exactly are you proposing?" Manipulated the holographic display, and a 3-dimensional tactical plan materialized before them. Seven has 3 things the swarm wants: deuterium for fuel, a population for biomass, and a strategic position controlling this entire sector. They're going to attack it within the next 2 cycles. I guarantee it. But instead of evacuating and retreating, we're going to fortify and ambush. He zoomed in on the planet. "First, we reinforce the orbital defenses, but we make them look minimal. We want the swarm to think this is an easy target. Second, we hide the bulk of our fleet in the asteroid field 2 light hours away. Third, we mine the approach vectors with delayed activation weapons. And fourth, we turn Seven itself into the biggest trap in galactic history." Captain's feathers ruffled with agitation. "You want to weaponize an entire planet? That's explicitly forbidden by the Accords." "I want to defend an inhabited world with every tool available," corrected. "There's a difference. Now here's what we're going to need." For the next 3 hours, outlined his plan in excruciating detail. It was unlike anything the coalition officers had ever seen. It involved deception, ambush tactics, weapons hidden in civilian infrastructure, and strategic use of the planet's own resources as improvised defenses. Every aspect of the plan pushed against the boundaries of acceptable warfare, dancing on the edge of the Accords without quite crossing the line. But what truly shocked the officers was the psychology behind it. Wasn't just planning a battle. He was planning to send a message to the swarm. A message that said humanity understood their nature, understood their drives, and knew how to exploit their weaknesses. "The swarm operates on biological imperatives," explained, pointing to analysis charts on swarm behavior. "They're driven by reproduction, resource acquisition, and expansion. They don't have fear in the way we understand it, but they do have survival instincts. They assess threats and avoid what seems like a losing proposition. Right now, they don't see you as a threat. You're just slow prey. We're going to change that perception." Commander studied the battle plan carefully. It was ruthless, efficient, and terrifyingly clever. It also required them to trust this old human completely, to put tens of thousands of lives and a significant portion of their military assets into a strategy that violated the spirit, if not the letter, of everything they believed about warfare. "What if it fails?" she asked quietly. Met her eyes, and she saw something there she hadn't noticed before: grief. Old, buried grief that had never quite healed. "Then you'll lose 7 the same way you've lost 35 other worlds, but at least you'll have tried something different. At least you'll have fought like you actually wanted to win." The council debated for another full day before approving the operation, which they thorned Garden. The name came from an old coalition proverb about beauty that protects itself. It seemed appropriate, even if the beauty in question was purely strategic. Implementing the plan required unprecedented cooperation between human and coalition forces. Requested a small contingent of human military engineers, specialists in what he called asymmetric warfare. When they arrived, they brought with them equipment and weapons that made even the most hardened coalition soldiers uncomfortable. Met with the human team in a secure briefing room. Their leader was a woman named Colonel Sarah, dark-skinned and sharp-eyed, who carried herself with the same quiet intensity as. She was younger than him, perhaps in her 50s, but she had the same look of someone who had seen things that couldn't be unseen. "Commander," Sarah said, shaking his hand, "tells me you're willing to try new approaches. That's brave." "It's desperate," corrected. "There's a difference." Sarah's smile was grim. "Sometimes those are the same thing. Let me show you what we've brought." The equipment room was filled with devices that seemed innocuous at first glance. Mining charges, industrial chemicals, agricultural drones, communications satellites. But as Sarah explained their proposed modifications, realized these were the building blocks of what humans called improvised warfare. "This is a standard mining charge," Sarah said, holding up a cylindrical device. "Used for excavating deuterium deposits, but with a few modifications to the detonation sequence and placement in specific structural, it becomes an effective area denial weapon. The Accords don't prohibit mining equipment, even in war zones." She moved to the next table. "These are pesticide distribution drones used in agricultural colonies, but the swarm has a weakness. Their communications are pheromone-based. We've analyzed samples from previous engagements. With the right chemical composition, we can disrupt their coordination, make their swarms disorganized and easy to pick off. The Accords don't prohibit pest control, even on worlds under siege." Felt her skin shifting between colors, unable to settle on a single emotion. Admiration, horror, and fascination all warred within her. "You're weaponizing civilian infrastructure." "We're using available resources for defensive purposes," Sarah corrected gently. "The swarm won't see the difference, and legally, neither will the council. That's the point. Your Accords were written by species that fight like you, honorable, direct, predictable. Humans learned a long time ago that honor is a luxury you can only afford when you're winning." Over the next 10 days, 7 was transformed. To any external observer, it looked like standard defensive preparations. Shields reinforced, weapon platforms upgraded, evacuation routes prepared. But beneath the surface, and his team had turned the entire planet into an elaborate trap. The civilian population, after being fully briefed on the risks and given the option to evacuate, had voted overwhelmingly to stay. They were miners, tough and pragmatic, and they understood that running from the swarm meant eventually running out of places to run to. Better to make a stand here with proper preparation than to wait for the inevitable on some other world. The civilians were armed and trained, not as soldiers but as defenders of their homes. The human engineers taught them guerrilla tactics, ambush strategies, and how to use their own mining equipment as weapons. It was all technically legal under the Accords, which allowed armed civilian defense of inhabited worlds. But the way they were being trained, the tactics they were learning, would have been unthinkable to coalition military doctrine just weeks ago. Spent hours walking the mining tunnels and domes with, explaining each layer of the defense. "The first rule of asymmetric warfare," he said as they inspected a camouflaged weapons cache, "is to make the enemy think they know what they're facing, then hit them with something completely unexpected. The swarm thinks they're attacking a lightly defended mining world. Instead, they're walking into a killing ground." "And if they adapt," asked, "if they learn from this and change their tactics?" Smile was cold. "Then we've achieved something even more valuable. We've made them afraid. Fear changes behavior. It makes enemies cautious, hesitant. Right now, the swarm isn't afraid of the coalition because you've never given them a reason to be. That changes today. The swarm arrived exactly when predicted, 2 cycles after the fortifications were complete. Their approach was detected by long-range sensors, a massive fleet of bioships, living vessels grown rather than built, numbering in the thousands. It was one of the largest swarm forces ever assembled, clearly intended to overwhelm 7 through sheer numbers. In the command center, watched the tactical display with her hearts pounding. This was the moment of truth. Either strategy would work, or they would lose not just 7, but also a significant portion of the coalition fleet. They're following predictable approach vectors, Captain reported. Moving in standard swarm formation, no indication they suspect anything unusual. Stood beside General Thrax, both men watching the enemy advance with experienced eyes. Patience, said quietly. Let them commit. Let them think they're winning. The swarm fleet began its assault on the orbital defenses, which had been deliberately weakened in certain sections. The bioships pushed through, taking losses but achieving penetration exactly where had predicted. They were following their programming, their biological imperatives, moving toward the richest resource concentrations. Now, said calmly. The asteroid field suddenly blazed with engine signatures as the hidden coalition fleet emerged, cutting off the swarm's retreat. Simultaneously, the supposedly weakened orbital defenses revealed their true strength, hidden weapon platforms coming online, and catching the swarm in a crossfire. The delayed activation mines that had been seeded throughout the approach vectors detonated in a carefully timed sequence, fragmenting the swarm formation. But wasn't done. As the swarm ships that survived the initial ambush tried to regroup, they found themselves flying through clouds of industrial chemicals released by modified mining drones. The pheromone-disrupting compounds did their work, and suddenly the perfectly coordinated swarm became a chaotic mess of individual ships, each acting independently, unable to communicate with their fellows. All ships execute hunting pattern Delta, General Thrax ordered, his voice filled with something that might have been excitement. Target the disoriented vessels, don't let them reform. The coalition fleet, for the first time in this war, wasn't retreating. They were attacking with coordinated precision, picking off isolated swarm ships that couldn't coordinate their defenses. It was a slaughter, efficient and brutal. But some swarm ships made it through to the planet's surface, landing in the mining zones and disgorging their warrior forms. This was what they did best, ground assault, overwhelming defenders with sheer numbers and biological weaponry. They had done it successfully on 17 worlds. 7 would be different. The swarm warriors surged through the mining tunnels, following the scent of biomass and resources. They were met by automated defenses, mining lasers for anti-personnel use, explosives in the tunnel walls, acidic chemicals from the refining process released into sealed sections. But these were just the first layer. The human-trained civilian defenders hit them with guerrilla tactics, ambushes from hidden positions, improvised explosives in choke points, collapsing tunnels to trap and separate swarm forces. Every meter of ground the swarm took was paid for in heavy casualties, and unlike previous engagements, the defenders weren't following predictable patterns. They would attack, then vanish into side tunnels. They would lure swarm warriors into dead ends and seal them in. They fought like humans had once fought against each other, dirty, clever, and without mercy. Watch the ground battle through surveillance feeds, providing real-time tactical advice to the civilian defenders. Section 7, fall back to the prepared position. Let them think they're winning, then hit them with the sealing charges. Section 3, good work on that ambush, now rotate to your secondary position before they can track you. Watched in fascination as the tide of the ground battle shifted. The swarm, which had never faced effective ground resistance, was being torn apart by tactics they couldn't predict or counter. Their biological imperatives drove them forward, seeking resources and biomass, but every advance led them into another trap. After 6 brutal hours, it was over. The swarm fleet had been decimated, with over 70% casualties. The ground forces had been wiped out completely, trapped and eliminated in the mining tunnels. The few ships that escaped fled at maximum speed, breaking formation and running individually. The coalition had lost only 12 ships and suffered 300 ground casualties, mostly wounded rather than killed. It was the most one-sided victory in the war so far, and it had been achieved by abandoning conventional tactics and embracing something darker and more effective. In the command center, the officers were celebrating, but stood quietly, watching the aftermath displays. Approached him, her skin a complex pattern of colors indicating mixed emotions. "We won," she said simply. "Yeah," replied, his voice heavy. "You won a battle by learning to fight like humans. Congratulations, now comes the hard part." "What's that?" Turned to face her, and she saw the full weight of his years in his expression. "Deciding who you want to be. Because now you know you can win if you're willing to bend your principles. The question is, how far are you willing to bend before you break? How much of your civilization are you willing to sacrifice to save it?" Before could respond, alarms began blaring throughout the command center. Captain called out urgently, "Commander, we're receiving reports from multiple sectors. The swarm is launching coordinated attacks on 6 different worlds simultaneously. This is much larger than anything we've seen before." General Thrax pulled up the tactical display, his 4 eyes widening in alarm. "These aren't minor outposts. They're targeting major population centers. Prime, the new. If these worlds fall, we lose billions of civilians." Studied the attack patterns carefully. "They're adapting already. They saw what happened at 7, and now they're trying to overwhelm you with simultaneous attacks, force you to spread your forces thin. We don't have enough ships to defend all 6 worlds with the tactics you used here," said, her voice tight with stress. "We'll have to evacuate and fall back. Or," said slowly, "you could let humans handle it." The command center fell silent. Every officer turned to look at the old human, who stood calmly despite the implications of what he just suggested. "Explain," General Thrax demanded. Pulled up a star chart showing human space, a relatively small region compared to the vast coalition territories. "The Human Systems Alliance has been building up our military while the rest of you focused on expansion and trade. We've got fleets designed for total war, not civilized skirmishes. We've got weapons you don't allow yourselves to use. And we've got experience fighting enemies that don't quit. Give us authorization and we'll save your worlds." "At what cost?" asked quietly. Met her eyes. "At the cost of your innocence. If humans enter this war, we'll fight it our way. We'll follow the letter of your accords, but we'll stretch them to their breaking point. We'll do things that will shock you, horrify you, maybe even disgust you. But we'll win." The choice hung in the air like a blade. They could evacuate the 6 worlds, follow their protocols, and accept the slow retreat that had characterized this war from the beginning. Or they could unleash humanity's capacity for violence, save those billions of lives, and live with the consequences of what that might mean for their civilization. Commander looked at the tactical display, at the 6 worlds under attack, at the billions of lives hanging in the balance. She thought about the Accords, about civilized warfare, about all the principles her civilization had built over thousands of years. Then she thought about what it would mean to abandon those worlds, those people, because she was too proud to accept help from a species that had learned to fight dirty. She made her decision. "General Thrax, send an emergency authorization to the Human Systems Alliance. Request immediate military intervention in all 6 sectors. Full operational authority granted to human commanders." Pulled out a communication device and entered a code. When he spoke, his voice was formal and heavy with meaning. "This is Consultant to Alliance Command, authorization code Alpha 77 Zulu, requesting full deployment of expeditionary fleets 1 through 6. Rules of engagement, Coalition Accords framework, maximum flexibility interpretation. Target, the swarm. Objective, total elimination of hostile forces in designated sectors. Confirm." The response came immediately. "Alliance Command confirms expeditionary fleets are mobilizing. Estimated arrival at designated sectors, 18 to 36 hours. Good hunting." Turned back to the coalition officers. "You wanted civilized war and it was killing you. Now you're going to see how humans fight when we stop being civilized. I hope you're ready for what that means." The human fleets arrived in waves, and they were nothing like what the coalition had expected. Where coalition vessels were elegant, designed with aesthetic considerations alongside military function, the human warships were brutal and utilitarian. They looked like weapons, pure and simple, with no concession to beauty or grace. They were gray slabs of armor and firepower, built with one purpose: to kill efficiently and survive the attempt. Commander watched from the Coalition command station as the first human fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Prime system. Prime was a jewel of coalition space, a tropical world with 2 billion inhabitants, known for its universities and cultural centers. The swarm had descended on it with a force of 5,000 bioships, clearly intending to harvest the massive population for biomass. The human fleet numbered only 300 ships, but they moved with a precision and coordination that spoke of extensive combat experience. At their head was a massive dreadnought, twice the size of any coalition vessel, bristling with weapon ports and armored like a fortress. Its transponder identified it as the HSAS Indomitable, flagship of Admiral Torres. A communication channel opened, and a woman's face appeared on the holographic display. She was in her 50s, with short gray hair and a scar across her left cheek. Her eyes were cold and analytical, the eyes of someone who had made hard decisions and lived with them. Coalition Command, this is Admiral Torres. We have the tactical situation in hand. Recommend you maintain position and observe. We'll clear the swarm from Prime within 12 hours. General Thrax, standing beside, clicked his mandibles skeptically. Admiral, the swarm force outnumbers you almost 17-1. Perhaps a combined operation would be more prudent. Admiral Torres' expression didn't change. General, with respect, we didn't come here to participate in a combined operation. We came here to solve your problem. Watch and learn. The communication cut off, leaving the coalition officers staring at the blank screen in shock. No ally had ever spoken to them with such blunt dismissal. But as they watched the tactical display, they began to understand why the Admiral was confident. The human fleet didn't engage the swarm in the traditional manner. Instead of forming battle lines and trading fire in the organized way civilized warfare demanded, they broke into smaller task forces and began what the humans called wolf pack tactics. Groups of 3 to 7 ships would isolate portions of the swarm fleet, hit them with overwhelming firepower from multiple angles, then disengage before the swarm could respond effectively. But it was the nature of the weapons themselves that truly shocked the coalition observers. The humans used kinetic bombardment. Massive solid slugs accelerated to relativistic speeds that struck swarm bioships with the force of nuclear weapons. They used plasma weaponry that burned through organic armor like it was paper. They used electromagnetic pulses that disrupted the swarm's biological nervous systems, leaving bioships dead in space. And they did it all without technically violating the Accords. Kinetic weapons weren't prohibited. Plasma had always been allowed. EMP was considered a non-lethal disabling technology. The humans had studied the Accords carefully and found every loophole, every ambiguous phrase, every gap in the regulations that well-meaning species had left when they wrote rules for civilized warfare. Within 6 hours, half the swarm fleet around Prime had been destroyed. The remaining bioships tried to flee, but the human ships were faster, more maneuverable. They hunted down every fleeing vessel with ruthless efficiency. There would be no survivors to report back to the swarm collective, no information about human tactics or capabilities. Then came the ground assault, and that's when the coalition observers truly understood what they had unleashed. Swarm warriors had landed on Prime in force, overwhelming the local defense forces and pushing deep into population centers. Standard coalition doctrine would have been to evacuate the cities and engage in open-field battles where civilian casualties could be minimized. The humans had other ideas. Descended through Prime's atmosphere, deploying not traditional soldiers, but something the humans called urban warfare specialists. They wore powered armor, carried weapons that could punch through building walls, and moved with a speed and aggression that seemed inhuman. But what truly set them apart was their tactics. They fought in the cities, among the civilians, using the urban environment as a weapon. They lured swarm warriors into buildings rigged with explosives, collapsed structures on top of advancing bug formations, and used the tight confines of city streets to negate the swarm's numerical advantage. They protected civilian populations not by evacuating them, but by fortifying residential areas and turning every block into a fortress. Captain watched the ground combat footage with her feathers standing on end in agitation. They're fighting in populated areas. This is exactly what the Accords prohibit. Civilian casualties will be enormous. But as the hours passed, a strange pattern emerged. Human casualties were moderate, swarm casualties were catastrophic, and civilian casualties were remarkably low. The humans were surgical in their violence, precise in their brutality. They had perfected the art of killing in close quarters while protecting non-combatants. Who had been silent throughout the engagement, finally spoke. Urban warfare was humanity's specialty long before we reached space. We learned how to fight in cities during our bloodiest conflicts. We learned how to protect civilians while killing enemies in the same building. It's ugly, it's terrifying, but it works. By the time the 12-hour mark arrived, Prime was secure. Every swarm warrior had been eliminated, the orbital assault had been completely repelled, and the human fleet was already preparing to jump to the next threatened system. The capital city of Prime had suffered structural damage, but casualties were less than 1% of the population, far lower than any evacuation would have achieved. Admiral Tor's face appeared on the communication screen again. Coalition Command, Prime is secure. We're moving to the... You might want to prepare your observers for what they're about to see there. It's going to be educational. The OV presented a different challenge. It was a desert planet, home to 4 billion of General Thrax's people, and the swarm had landed not in population centers, but in the vast underground aquifer systems that provided water for the entire planet. Standard doctrine would have been to abandon the aquifers and provide water through orbital delivery, an expensive but safe solution. The human response was characteristically different. They sent engineering teams into the aquifers, tracking down every swarm warrior in the underground system. But they didn't just fight them. They studied them, analyzed their biology, understood their life cycle and vulnerabilities. Then they weaponized that knowledge. The humans introduced a modified bacteria into the aquifer system, one that was harmless to biology but lethal to the swarm. It attacked the biological processes that allowed swarm warriors to process nutrients, essentially starving them from the inside out. Within 48 hours, every swarm organism in the aquifer system was dead. When the Coalition Council learned about this, they convened an emergency session. What the humans had done looked dangerously close to biological warfare, which was explicitly prohibited by the Accords. But when they examined the details, they found another loophole. The bacteria used was naturally occurring, simply modified for enhanced effect. The Accords prohibited the creation of new biological weapons, but said nothing about optimizing existing biological processes for defensive purposes. Commander confronted about it privately in her office. "You're playing word games with our most fundamental laws." Leaned back in his chair, looking tired. "No, Commander, your laws are playing word games with reality. The Accords were written by species that never faced an existential threat, that never had to choose between survival and principles. Every rule has exceptions built into it because deep down, the species that wrote them knew that sometimes you have to bend the rules to survive. Humans didn't create those loopholes. We just learned to use them." "So this is what winning looks like." Skin flashed angry red. "Finding ways to technically comply with laws while violating their spirit." "This is what survival looks like," corrected quietly. "And you asked for it. You asked humans to save those 6 worlds, and we did. We saved billions of lives using tactics that make you uncomfortable. But those billions are alive because we were willing to do what was necessary." Over the next week, the pattern repeated across all 6 threatened worlds. The human fleets arrived, engaged the swarm with ruthless efficiency, and eliminated every hostile presence. They used tactics that shocked coalition sensibilities but never quite crossed the line into outright violations of the Accords. They were brilliant, brutal, and terrifyingly effective. But something else was happening, something that worried more than any single battle. Young coalition officers were watching the humans, studying their tactics, admiring their efficiency. She could see it in their eyes, a growing belief that perhaps the old ways were obsolete, that the humans had found a better path. She called a private meeting with senior coalition leadership, including General Thrax and representatives from the major species. They gathered in a secure conference room, away from human observers. "We need to discuss what's happening," began. "The humans are winning, yes. They're saving worlds and lives, but they're also teaching our people that the Accords are optional, that everything we've built our civilization on is negotiable." A counselor named spoke up, his silver feathers gleaming in the dim light. "Are you suggesting we ask the humans to leave, to go back to our old tactics and accept defeat?" "I'm suggesting we consider the cost of victory," replied. "Every engagement, every battle, the humans push closer to lines we never wanted to cross. How long before one of our own officers decides to use their methods? How long before we become the kind of civilization we fought so hard not to be?" General Thrax surprisingly came to defense. "Commander, I've watched the humans operate. Yes, they're aggressive. Yes, they bend rules, but they're also honorable in their own way. They protect civilians. They don't take prisoners, but they don't torture. They kill efficiently, but they don't cause unnecessary suffering. They're not monsters. They're just survivors. Is there a difference? Asked. When we start using bacteria as weapons, when we fight wars in city streets, when we hunt down every enemy with the intention of leaving no survivors, how are we different from the swarm? The question hung in the air, unanswered. It was who answered it, though he wasn't supposed to be present. He walked into the conference room without invitation, and before anyone could object, he spoke. The difference, Commander, is choice. The swarm doesn't choose to consume and expand. That's their nature, their programming. They can't be reasoned with or negotiated with. They're a force of nature, but you choose how you fight. You choose what lines you cross and what lines you defend. That choice is what makes you civilized, not the rules you follow. How did you get in here? Demanded. This was a private meeting. I'm old, not stupid, said. And I knew you'd be having this conversation eventually. You're wrestling with something humans dealt with centuries ago. The question of whether the ends justify the means, whether survival is worth compromising your principles. He walked to the holographic display and pulled up images from Earth's history. Humans have fought wars where we lost everything. Our cities, our infrastructure, our sense of who we were. We've made terrible choices, used terrible weapons, done things that still haunt us. And you know what we learned? That there's no such thing as a clean war. There's no way to fight and die with honor when the enemy wants to exterminate you. You can either adapt and survive, or you can maintain your principles and go extinct. So your answer is to abandon principles entirely, challenged. My answer is to know which principles are worth dying for and which are just comfortable illusions, replied. The Accords are beautiful in theory. They represent everything good about galactic civilization. But they only work when both sides agree to follow them. The swarm doesn't agree. They never will. So you have a choice. Adapt your principles to reality or watch your civilization die while clinging to ideals the enemy doesn't share. General Thrax stood, all four of his eyes fixed on. And what happens after? When the swarm is defeated, when the crisis is over? Do we go back to civilized warfare or have we changed forever? His expression was sad. That's not for me to answer, General. That's for you to decide. Humans made our choice long ago. We accepted that we're capable of terrible things when necessary. We built safeguards, laws, and customs to prevent us from going too far, but we never forgot what we're capable of. We never lied to ourselves about our nature. He turned to leave, then paused at the door. The swarm is pushing toward the coalition core worlds. They're not stopping, not slowing down. In 2 months, maybe less, they'll reach your most populated systems. You can keep debating the ethics of how we fight, or you can accept that sometimes survival requires getting your hands dirty. Either way, humanity will keep doing what we do best, winning wars at any cost. After left, the conference room was silent for a long time. Finally spoke, her voice heavy with resignation. Put it to a vote. Do we continue the human partnership with all it entails, or do we ask them to withdraw and handle this ourselves? The vote was closer than anyone expected, but the decision was made. The humans would stay. The partnership would continue. The coalition would learn to win, even if it meant compromising the principles they had held for. But made one additional requirement. I want human officers embedded with our forces, not just as consultants, but as active participants. If we're going to learn to fight like them, we need to understand not just their tactics, but their thinking, their mindset. This was approved, and within days, human officers were assigned to coalition fleets and ground forces across the front lines. One of them was a young lieutenant named James Park, assigned to captain's ship. The was not pleased. She prided herself on running a proper military vessel with discipline and adherence to protocols. Having a human aboard, one who represented everything she found distasteful about this new approach to warfare, was an insult. Lieutenant Park reported to her ready room, standing at attention with crisp military bearing. He was young, probably no more than 30, with dark eyes and a calm demeanor. Captain Lieutenant James Park reporting for duty. Looked him up and down, her feathers ruffling with barely concealed irritation. Lieutenant, I want to make something clear. On my ship, we follow coalition protocols. We fight with honor. Whatever tactics your people use elsewhere, here we do things the right way. Understood. Park's expression didn't change. Understood, Captain. With respect, might I suggest that the right way is whatever keeps your crew and ship intact. My job isn't to corrupt your principles. It's to keep you alive long enough to have principles. It was a tense beginning to what would become a transformative relationship. Over the next weeks, as the engaged swarm forces in multiple skirmishes began to see the value in human thinking, even if she didn't always approve of it. During one engagement, her tactical officer recommended the standard response to a swarm probe: engage, inflict moderate casualties, withdraw before losses mount. Lieutenant Park quietly suggested an alternative: let the probe retreat, track it back to the main swarm fleet, then use that intelligence to set an ambush. That's deceptive, objected. We don't use deception in warfare. Why not? Park asked simply. Deception saves lives, your lives specifically. The swarm isn't going to give you a medal for being straightforward. They're going to use your predictability to kill you. Reluctantly approved the plan. They tracked the swarm probe to a staging area where a much larger fleet was assembling. Instead of engaging directly, they called in support and hit the swarm while they were vulnerable, destroying a fleet that would have threatened multiple systems. It was a decisive victory, achieved through deception, through thinking like the enemy, through abandoning the clean, honorable approach that had cost the coalition so many losses. And it worked. Slowly, painfully, the coalition military was changing. They were learning to fight smart instead of honorable, to prioritize results over principles, to accept that sometimes the ends did justify the means. The transformation wasn't easy, and it wasn't without resistance. There were officers who refused to adapt, who insisted on following the old ways. Most of them didn't survive long. But the most profound changes were happening in the command structure itself. As the war continued, as human tactics proved their effectiveness time and again, the coalition began promoting officers who embraced the new approach. Traditional commanders who valued honor and restraint found themselves sidelined in favor of younger, more aggressive leaders who understood that this war would be won by adaptation, not tradition. Commander watched this transformation with mixed feelings. On one hand, they were winning. Systems that would have fallen were holding. The swarm's advance had not just slowed, but stopped. For the first time since the war began, the coalition was gaining ground. On the other hand, she barely recognized her own military anymore. The principles that had guided them were being eroded, replaced by human pragmatism and ruthless efficiency. She met with again in what had become a regular occurrence. They would sit in her office, looking out at the stars, and discuss the state of the war and what it was costing them. "We're becoming like you," she said without preamble. "Is that what you wanted?" Shook his head. "What I wanted was for you to survive. How you do that is up to you. But I'll tell you something my old commander told me when I was young and idealistic. Civilization is a luxury built on survival. You can't be civilized if you're dead. First, you survive, then you figure out how to stay civilized. And if we can't do both, if survival requires us to abandon what makes us civilized." Was quiet for a long moment. "Then you make the hard choice. But here's the thing, Commander, you're not abandoning civilization, you're fighting to preserve it. The swarm would wipe out everything you've built, all your art and culture and achievements. Using harsh methods to preserve that isn't abandonment, it's sacrifice." "Sacrifice," repeated. "That's one word for it. Others might call it corruption or moral decay." "Others who aren't fighting for survival," countered. "It's easy to judge from a position of safety. It's harder to make the choices when billions of lives depend on you." As they sat in silence, watching the distant stars, realized that the war had already changed her more than she wanted to admit. 6 months ago, she would have never considered using the tactics they now employed routinely. She would have found human methods barbaric and unconscionable. Now, she found herself appreciating their efficiency, admiring their results, even if she still struggled with the implications. The question that kept her awake at night was simple. When the war ended, if it ever ended, could they go back? Could the coalition return to civilized warfare, to the accords, to the principles that had defined them? Or would they forever be changed by what they had learned, what they had done, what they had become to survive? Seemed to read her thoughts. "You're wondering if you can ever go back to normal." "Can we?" He considered this carefully before answering. "That depends on what you mean by normal. Will you fight exactly like you did before this war? Probably not. You've learned too much, seen too much of what works. But can you maintain your core values, your sense of what makes you different from the swarm? Yes, if you choose to. Humans did it. We came back from our darkest wars and rebuilt our civilization better than before in many ways. We learned to use force when necessary, but never forgot why we were fighting in the first place." "I hope you're right," said softly. Because right now I'm not sure what we're becoming. The turning point came 8 months into the Human Coalition partnership, during what would later be called the Battle of Nexus Station. Nexus was the central hub of Coalition space, a massive orbital platform that served as the government seat, trade center, and symbolic heart of galactic civilization. Losing Nexus would mean more than a military defeat. It would represent the collapse of everything the Coalition stood for. The Swarm knew this. They had been gathering their forces for months, pulling back from minor engagements, consolidating their strength. Intelligence reports suggested they were preparing for a massive assault, but the true scale wasn't understood until their fleet emerged from faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Nexus system. 30,000 bioships. It was the largest swarm force ever assembled, a living armada that darkened the stars. They came in perfect formation, moving with unified purpose toward the heart of Coalition space. Every available military asset in the sector was scrambled to Nexus Station's defense, but even combined with the human fleets, they were outnumbered 5-1. Commander stood in the main tactical center of Nexus Station, surrounded by holographic displays showing the approaching doom. Around her, officers from every Coalition species worked frantically to coordinate the defense. The human contingent, led by Admiral Torres and including, occupied one corner of the room, already planning their response. "We can't win this fight," General Thrax said bluntly, his 4 eyes reflecting the tactical displays. "Not with conventional tactics. Even with human methods, the numbers are overwhelming. We need to evacuate the civilian population and prepare for a fighting retreat." "Evacuating 200 million people will take weeks," countered. "The swarm will be here in 36 hours. We don't have time." Admiral Torres approached, her face grim but determined. "There's another option. It requires trust, complete operational freedom, and the willingness to do something that will horrify your council. But it will save Nexus Station and everyone on it." "What option?" asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know. Torres pulled up a holographic display showing the Nexus system's layout. "We don't fight them here at Nexus. We fight them there." She highlighted a point several light towers away, near a massive asteroid field. "We use Nexus as bait, draw them in, make them commit everything to the assault. Then we hit them with something they've never seen before and won't see coming." "What could possibly stop 30,000 ships?" General Thrax demanded. Stepped forward, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight that silenced every objection before it could form. "A weapon humanity developed during our darkest conflicts. Something we swore we'd never use again. Something that breaks every principle of civilized warfare but might be the only thing that saves you now." Felt her skin turn icy blue with dread. "What kind of weapon?" "The kind that makes entire fleets disappear," said quietly. "The kind that ends wars in minutes but haunts the survivors for generations. We call them Kasaba howitzers, directed nuclear pulse weapons, focused fusion explosions that create beams of plasma and radiation intense enough to vaporize anything in their path. When humanity was at war with itself, we built thousands of them, positioned throughout our solar system as a last line of defense. We never used them. We didn't have to. But we kept them, maintained them, just in case we ever faced an extinction-level threat again." The tactical center went completely silent. Nuclear weapons were the ultimate taboo, the one thing the Accords absolutely prohibited under any circumstances. The destruction they could cause, the lingering radiation, the indiscriminate nature of their effects, made them anathema to civilized species. "You're talking about using weapons of mass destruction," Counselor said, his silver feathers standing on end in horror. "That's not bending the Accords, that's shattering them completely." "Yes," Admiral Torres agreed without hesitation. "It is, but consider your alternative. Lose Nexus Station, lose your government center, lose 200 million civilians, and probably lose this war. The Swarm has gathered everything for this assault. If they succeed here, they'll have momentum to push all the way to your core worlds. In 2 years, maybe less, the Coalition will cease to exist." "And if we use these weapons?" asked. "What then? We become mass murderers. We abandon everything we believe in." Walk to the display showing the approaching Swarm fleet. "Look at them. Really look. Those aren't ships with crews who have families, who have choice, who can surrender or negotiate. Those are biological machines driven by instinct to consume and expand. Their weapons themselves, grown and deployed for one purpose. Using a weapon to destroy weapons isn't murder, it's survival. The Accords don't distinguish based on the nature of the enemy," General Thrax pointed out, though his voice lacked conviction. "Then maybe the Accords are wrong," a new voice said. Everyone turned to see Captain entering the tactical center with Lieutenant Park beside her. The officer looked different from when had last seen her, harder somehow, more resolute. "I've spent 8 months working with Lieutenant Park, learning human methods, seeing their effectiveness. I've also watched good soldiers die following protocols that the enemy ignores. Admiral Torres is right. We're facing extinction. The time for half measures is over." Her statement sent shockwaves through the command center. Had been one of the most traditional officers in the coalition fleet, a vocal critic of human tactics. If she was advocating for using weapons of mass destruction, it meant the transformation was more complete than anyone had realized. "Captain, do you understand what you're supporting?" Counselor demanded. "The use of nuclear weapons could poison the Nexus system for centuries." "Lieutenant Park, explain," said, stepping aside. The young human officer activated a technical display. "The Kasaba howitzers are different from traditional nuclear weapons. They're directional, focused. The energy is channeled into a narrow beam rather than exploding. Yes, there will be radiation, but localized and manageable. More importantly, we can position them in the asteroid field, away from inhabited space. The swarm fleet will have to pass through that field to reach Nexus. We trigger the weapons when they're in the kill zone, and the beams will vaporize the majority of their fleet before they even know what's happening." "And the survivors?" asked. "There won't be many," Admiral Torres said flatly. "But your conventional forces, reinforced by our fleets, can handle whatever's left. This isn't about fighting fair. This is about survival." Looked around the tactical center, seeing the faces of officers from dozens of species, all grappling with the same impossible choice. Then she looked at the old human who had started all of this, who had shown them a different way to fight. "Why didn't you suggest this immediately?" she asked him. "Why wait until now?" His expression was sad. "Because I hoped you wouldn't need it, because using these weapons changes you in ways you can't undo. Humans live with the memory of what we did to each other, the knowledge that we're capable of total annihilation. We carry that burden every day. I didn't want that for you, but the swarm isn't giving us a choice. It's this or it's extinction." The decision couldn't be made by alone. She called an emergency council session, bringing together the leadership of every coalition species via faster-than-light communication. The debate that followed was the most intense in coalition history, with representatives passionately arguing both sides. Those opposed invoked the founding principles of the coalition, the of peace achieved through the Accords, the moral imperative to be better than those who would destroy them. They argued that using weapons of mass destruction would make them no different from the swarm, that some prices were too high even for survival. Those in favor pointed to the 30,000 bioships approaching Nexus, to the 200 million civilians who would die if the station fell, to the inevitable collapse of the coalition if they lost this battle. They argued that principles meant nothing if there was no one left alive to uphold them. The vote was closer than had feared it would be, but eventually authorization was granted. The coalition would use human nuclear weapons for the first time in galactic history. The decision came with conditions. This would be the only time such weapons were deployed. Their use was strictly limited to the asteroid field away from populated areas, and every precaution would be taken to minimize collateral damage. Received the authorization with a heavy expression. "I need 12 hours to get the weapons in position. During that time, you need to convince the swarm that Nexus Station is vulnerable, that this is their moment of victory." What followed was the most elaborate deception in coalition military history. They made Nexus Station appear to be in chaos, with ships evacuating in disarray, defense platforms malfunctioning, and communication channels full of panicked transmissions. They fed false intelligence through captured swarm scouts, suggesting that coalition forces were scattered and unprepared. They made it look like the perfect opportunity for the swarm to strike a devastating blow. The swarm took the bait. Their massive fleet accelerated toward Nexus, moving through the predetermined path that would take them through the asteroid field. They were completely focused on their target, driven by their biological imperatives to seize the opportunity before them. In the asteroid field, human engineers had positioned 27 Kasaba howitzers, each one a cylinder of exotic materials surrounding a thermonuclear explosive. They had been transported in secret, assembled in zero gravity, and camouflaged among the asteroids to appear as nothing more than coalition sensor buoys. The swarm scanners detected them but dismissed them as irrelevant. Commander watched from Nexus Station's command center as the swarm fleet entered the asteroid field. Around her, every officer was silent, holding their breath, knowing that in moments they would either save their civilization or condemn themselves to becoming something they had sworn never to be. Admiral Torres stood with her hand over the activation control. She looked at one last time. "Last chance to change your mind, Commander. Once I trigger these weapons, there's no going back. Not for you, not for the Coalition." Thought about her people, about the billions of lives depending on this moment, about the civilization they had built over thousands of years. She thought about the Accords, about civilized warfare, about all the principles that had seemed so important before the swarm arrived. Then she thought about what would happen if they lost, if the swarm consumed everything they had created, if all their art and culture and achievements vanished because they were too proud to fight dirty. She made her choice. Fire. Admiral Torres pressed the activation control. In the asteroid field, 27 nuclear explosions occurred simultaneously, but these weren't the massive omnidirectional blasts of traditional nuclear weapons. The Kasaba howitzers channeled the fusion energy into focused beams of plasma and radiation, invisible spears of destruction that lanced through space at near-light speed. The beams hit the swarm fleet while they were tightly grouped, maximizing their vulnerable density. Bioships simply ceased to exist as the plasma beams passed through them, vaporizing organic armor and flesh in microseconds. The radiation pulse that followed killed everything biological within a massive radius. In less than 30 seconds, 26,000 swarm vessels were destroyed utterly, leaving nothing but expanding clouds of plasma and debris. The 4,000 surviving swarm ships broke formation, their coordination disrupted by the sudden loss of most of their fleet. They tried to scatter to escape, but the Coalition and human fleets were waiting. For the first time in the war, they had numerical superiority, and they used it with ruthless efficiency. Wolf pack tactics, coordinated strikes, overwhelming firepower focused on isolated targets. The survivors lasted less than 3 hours. When it was over, the Nexus system was secure, and the largest swarm fleet ever assembled had been completely annihilated. It was the most decisive victory in Coalition history, achieved at the cost of 0 military casualties and 0 civilian deaths. But as watched the aftermath on the tactical displays, she felt no triumph, only a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. They had won, but at what cost? They had used weapons of mass destruction, had killed 30,000 bioships in half a minute, had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Found her standing alone in an observation lounge, looking out at the stars. He didn't say anything at first, just stood beside her, 2 old soldiers who had seen too much and lived too long. "Does it get easier?" finally asked, "living with what you've done?" "No," said honestly. "It doesn't, but you learn to carry it. You remember why you did it, who you saved, what you preserved. That doesn't make it right, but it makes it bearable." "My people will never look at me the same way," said quietly. "Some will call me a hero, others will call me a war criminal, but they'll all know that I was the one who authorized using weapons of mass destruction. That's my legacy now." "No," disagreed gently. "Your legacy is those 200 million people on Nexus Station who are alive because of your decision. Your legacy is the Coalition that still exists because you were willing to make the hard choice. History will judge you, but history is written by the living. Make sure there are enough living to remember why you did what you did." They stood in silence for a while, watching the repair ships move among the debris field, beginning the long process of cleaning up the aftermath of the battle. Finally, turned to with a question that had been building in her mind for months. "Why did humanity really help us? You could have stayed neutral, let us fall, expanded into our territory afterward. Why risk your own people, share your weapons, teach us your methods?" Took a long time to answer. When he did, his voice carried the weight of centuries of human history. "Because we remember what it's like to face extinction. We remember being alone, afraid, fighting for survival against enemies that wanted us dead. We remember how it felt when no one came to help us, when we had to learn the hard lessons ourselves. And we swore that if we ever had the chance, if we ever saw another species facing what we faced, we'd help them. Not because it benefits us, but because we remember what it cost us to survive alone. Even if helping us means we become like you, violent, ruthless, willing to use weapons of mass destruction." "You're not becoming like us," said firmly. "You're becoming survivors. There's a difference. Humans fought each other for thousands of years, killed each other over resources and ideology and stupid pride. You're fighting for your existence against an enemy that gives you no choice. What we taught you isn't how to be violent, it's how to survive violence. Once the swarm is defeated, what you do with those lessons is up to you. And if we can't go back, if we've changed too much, smiled sadly, then you adapt, like humanity did. You find new ways to be civilized, new principles that acknowledge reality instead of denying it. You build safeguards against the worst of what you're capable of while accepting that capability exists. You become better not by pretending you're not dangerous, but by choosing when and how to be dangerous. News of the Battle of Nexus Station spread throughout Coalition space within hours. The reaction was complex and divided. Many celebrated the decisive victory, the salvation of Nexus Station, the turning of the tide against the swarm. Others expressed horror at the use of nuclear weapons, calling for tribunals and punishment for those who had authorized their deployment. The Council was forced to address the controversy directly. In an unprecedented public statement, they acknowledged that weapons of mass destruction had been used, explained the circumstances that led to the decision, and declared that it would be the only time such weapons were deployed. They established new protocols, new oversight, new limitations on what tactics could be employed even in desperate circumstances. But the damage to Coalition innocence was done. They had crossed a line, and everyone knew it. The Accords were quietly amended to include exceptions for existential threats, a phrase vague enough to justify almost anything yet specific enough to provide some restraint. It was a compromise that satisfied no one but allowed the Coalition to move forward. The war itself changed dramatically after Nexus Station. The Swarm, having lost their largest fleet and seeing the Coalition's willingness to use devastating weapons, became more cautious. They no longer launched massive assaults but instead focused on smaller, more strategic targets. The Coalition, having tasted decisive victory, pressed their advantage. They hunted down swarm fleets with coordinated operations, destroyed breeding grounds before new ships could be grown, and gradually pushed the swarm back toward their home systems. The transformation of Coalition military doctrine was complete. Gone were the formal battle lines and restrained engagements. In their place were aggressive tactics, psychological warfare, strategic deception, and overwhelming force. Young officers trained in these new methods, learning from both Coalition veterans and human advisors. A new generation of military leaders emerged, comfortable with the harsh realities of modern warfare but still attempting to maintain ethical boundaries where possible. Captain, now promoted to Commodore, commanded a task force that specialized in deep strike operations against swarm logistics. She worked closely with Lieutenant Park, who had become her executive officer despite initial resistance from traditional Coalition officers. Together, they represented the new Coalition military, experienced Coalition leadership combined with human tactical innovation, creating something more effective than either could achieve alone. Commander, despite the controversy surrounding her decision at Nexus Station, was promoted to Fleet Admiral and given command of all Coalition military operations. She had become the symbol of the Coalition's transformation, respected by some, reviled by others, but acknowledged by all as the leader who had made the hard choices when they were needed most. Having seen the Coalition through its darkest period prepared to return to human space, his job was done. The Coalition had learned to fight, had learned to win, had learned to accept the harsh realities of survival. They no longer needed him. Before he left, hosted a small gathering in his honor, attended by the officers who had worked most closely with him. There were no speeches, no formal ceremonies, just soldiers who had fought together, sharing a quiet moment before parting ways. "What will you do now?" asked as the gathering wound down. "Go home," said simply. "Rest. Try to forget what it feels like to teach people how to kill efficiently. Maybe write a book that nobody will read about the costs of victory." "Will you ever come back?" Looked thoughtful. "Only if you need me. And I hope you never do. What I taught you was necessary, but it shouldn't be the first option. It should be the last resort, the thing you do when everything else has failed. If you remember that, if you use these methods only when you have to, then maybe you can preserve what makes you different from humanity's violent past." As transport departed Nexus Station heading back to human space, watched from the observation deck with mixed feelings. He had saved them, there was no question of that. Without human intervention, the Coalition would have fallen months ago. But he had also changed them fundamentally, taken away their innocence, shown them capabilities they wish they had never needed. The question now was whether they could maintain their civilization while accepting these changes, or if the transformation had been too profound. Only time would tell if the coalition could remain true to its founding principles while acknowledging the harsh realities had taught them. One thing was certain, they would never be the same again. The coalition that emerged from this war would be harder, more realistic, more willing to do what was necessary. Whether that made them better or worse remained to be seen. As she turned away from the viewport, made a silent promise to herself and to her civilization. They would win this war, they would survive, but they would never forget what it cost them. The memory of that cost 2 years after the Battle of Nexus Station, the war against the Swarm was in its final stages. The coalition, transformed by human tactics and hardened by necessity, had pushed the Swarm back to their home systems. What had once seemed like an unstoppable force now appeared cornered and desperate. The question that haunted every coalition leader was not whether they would win, but what winning would mean. Fleet Admiral stood on the bridge of her flagship, the Covenant, watching the holographic display that showed the Swarm's last stronghold. A binary star system containing 3 inhabited worlds and a massive asteroid belt converted into breeding grounds. Intelligence estimated 12,000 Swarm bioships remained, along with billions of ground-based organisms. It was the heart of the Swarm, their origin, and now their final refuge. Around her, the combined coalition fleet numbered 15,000 ships, including 5 human battle groups that had remained as part of the ongoing military partnership. It was the largest military force ever assembled in galactic history, brought together for one purpose: ending the Swarm threat permanently. "Final reconnaissance reports are coming in," reported Commodore from her position at the tactical station. The officer had changed significantly from the tradition-bound captain who had once objected to human methods. Now she was one of the coalition's most effective commanders, blending coalition discipline with human tactical innovation. "The Swarm is fortified across all 3 worlds and throughout the asteroid breeding grounds. They're not preparing to flee, they're preparing to defend." General Thrax, now Supreme Commander of Coalition Ground Forces, studied the planetary defenses with his 4 eyes. "They know we're coming. They know what we're capable of, and they're going to make us pay for every meter of ground we take." Admiral Torres, representing the human contingent, stepped forward. Her hair had gone completely gray in the past 2 years, and new scars marked her face, but her eyes remained sharp and analytical. "The question isn't whether we can defeat them. The question is what we do after. Do we occupy their worlds? Do we quarantine them? Do we commit genocide?" The word hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Genocide, the complete elimination of an entire species. It was the ultimate war crime, the one act that every civilized species agreed was beyond any justification. Yet here they were, discussing it seriously. "The Swarm cannot be reasoned with," Counselor said via holographic communication from Nexus Station. His silver feathers looked dull, as if the weight of these decisions had physically aged him. "We have tried communication, negotiation, even surrender offers. They respond only with expansion and consumption. If we leave them alive, they will rebuild and attack again. Perhaps not in our lifetimes, but eventually." "So we kill them all?" asked quietly. "Every Swarm organism in this system, we become exterminators. We become survivors." His voice came through the communication system. He had returned to Coalition space at its request, though reluctantly. The old human looked even more tired than before, as if the weight of his years had finally become too heavy to bear easily. But there might be another way, something between complete genocide and leaving a threat alive. He pulled up biological data on the Swarm. "We've studied them for 2 years now. We understand their reproductive cycle, their genetic programming, their biological imperatives. What if instead of killing them all, we changed them? Genetic modification to remove their aggressive expansion instincts, to make them content to stay in one system, to make them incapable of the kind of warfare they've waged." The suggestion sent shockwaves through the command center. Genetic modification of an entire species was arguably worse than simple extermination, a violation of sovereignty so profound that there was barely a word for it. "That's not war," General Thrax said, his mandibles clicking in agitation. I don't even know what that is, rewriting a species' fundamental nature." "It's survival," Torres countered. "If we kill them all, we're murderers. If we leave them as they are, we're fools who guarantee our descendants will fight this war again. If we change them, we're playing God, but at least everyone lives. Sometimes there are no good choices, only less terrible ones. Lieutenant James Park, now captain and second in command, spoke up. The technology exists. Humans developed it centuries ago during our biological warfare phase. We never used it on ourselves because we recognized how horrifying it was. But this isn't modification for conquest or control. It's modification for coexistence. We'd be making it possible for both species to survive without conflict. And if the modification fails, Counselor asked, if they adapt around it or if we miss something in our understanding of their biology, we could create something worse than what we're facing now. Then we're no worse off than if we tried to exterminate them and missed some, said bluntly. At least this way, we tried to find a solution that doesn't involve becoming mass murderers. The debate continued for hours, with representatives from dozens of species weighing in. Some argued for complete extermination as the only way to guarantee safety. Others advocated for quarantine, surrounding the swarm's home system with monitoring stations and agreeing to destroy any ships that tried to leave. Still others supported suggestion of genetic modification, seeing it as a compromise between security and morality. Finally called for a vote among the military leadership present. It was not technically proper procedure, but these were the people who would have to implement whatever decision was made. They deserved a voice. The vote was razor-thin, but the decision was made. They would attempt genetic modification. If it failed, if the swarm proved too adaptable, or if the modification was incomplete, they would fall back to more extreme measures. But they would try to find a solution that didn't require genocide. The plan required weeks of preparation. Human genetic engineers worked with coalition scientists to develop a viral agent that would rewrite key sections of swarm DNA, specifically targeting the biological imperatives that drove their aggressive expansion. It had to be infectious enough to spread throughout the entire swarm population, stable enough to not mutate unpredictably, and irreversible once implemented. During this time, the coalition fleet maintained a blockade around the swarm home system, destroying any ships that attempted to flee while broadcasting surrender terms in every conceivable format. The swarm, predictably, ignored all communications and continued fortifying their defenses. Then came reports that changed everything. Scout ships equipped with advanced sensors detected something that intelligence analysts had missed before: variations in swarm biology. Not all swarm organisms were identical. Some showed signs of individual decision-making, of creativity, of what might be considered consciousness beyond simple biological programming. "They're not all drones," Captain Park reported, his face pale as he presented the data. "Some of them, maybe 1 in 10,000, show neural complexity comparable to sentient species. They might be capable of thought, of choice, of being something more than biological machines." This revelation threw the entire plan into chaos. If some swarm organisms were sentient, did that change the moral calculus? Could they justify genetic modification of beings that might be capable of understanding and changing their behavior? Or did it make the modification more necessary, allowing these potential individuals to break free from the biological imperatives that drove their species? Called an emergency meeting of all senior commanders. The mood in the conference room was tense, with officers who had fought together for 2 years suddenly divided again on fundamental principles. "If they're sentient, we have to try communication again," Commodore argued. "Give them a chance to choose peace." "We've tried communication for years," General Thrax countered. "If these individuals exist, they haven't made themselves known. They haven't attempted to contact us or stop their species' aggression. Maybe they're enslaved by their own biology, unable to act against their programming. The modification might actually free them." Sat quietly through most of the debate, looking older than had ever seen him. Finally, he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had wrestled with impossible choices for longer than most species had known war. "When I was young, my people fought a war over what made someone human. We had created artificial intelligences, machines that could think and feel but weren't born from human flesh. Some said they deserved rights, protection, the chance to exist as equals. Others said they were just sophisticated tools, no different from any other technology. We nearly tore ourselves apart over that question." He paused, collecting his thoughts. "You know what we learned? That the question of consciousness, of personhood, of who deserves moral consideration is one that never has a clean answer. But we developed a principle: when in doubt, err on the side of assuming consciousness. If there's even a chance that something can suffer, that it can understand its existence, then it deserves consideration. So you're saying we should abandon the modification plan? Torres asked. I'm saying we should give them a choice, replied. We've proven we can defeat them militarily. We've shown we have weapons that can destroy their entire species. Now we offer them an alternative: accept modification that removes their aggressive expansion instinct or be destroyed. Let them choose. They won't choose, General Thrax said with certainty. Their biology won't allow them to surrender. Then we'll have our answer, said sadly, and we'll do what we have to do, knowing we gave them every chance. The message was crafted carefully, translated into every conceivable format, and broadcast throughout the Swarm home system. It explained the situation simply. The Coalition had the capability to destroy the Swarm completely, but they were offering an alternative. Accept genetic modification that would remove aggressive expansion instincts while preserving all other aspects of Swarm biology and consciousness, or face complete extermination. The Swarm had 48 hours to respond. For 36 hours, there was only silence. The Swarm continued their defensive preparations, showing no sign of having received or understood the message. Coalition forces prepared for the final assault, ready to deploy either the genetic modification weapon or conventional overwhelming force. Then, with 12 hours remaining before the deadline, something unprecedented happened. A single Swarm bioship approached the Coalition fleet under what appeared to be a white flag, an ancient human symbol for peaceful intent that had been included in the message as a reference image. The ship was allowed to approach, though every weapon system in the fleet tracked it carefully. The ship didn't land or dock. Instead, it released a communication drone, a simple device that transmitted a message in crude but understandable Coalition common language. The message was brief and shocking. We understand, we accept, change us. The communications department the message's authenticity while analyzed the ship's behavior. The consensus was clear. This was a genuine response, likely from one of the sentient Swarm individuals that had been detected. But one ship didn't represent all of the Swarm. General Thrax raised the obvious objection. One individual accepting doesn't mean the species accepts. The vast majority are still driven by biological programming. They might not even be capable of consenting to this. Which is why we use the one ship as proof of concept, Torres suggested. We deploy the genetic modification agent on that single ship and its crew. Study the results. If it works, if they survive and remain conscious but without the aggressive expansion instinct, then we deploy it system-wide. If it fails, if it kills them or turns them into something worse, then we abandon this plan and move to alternatives. It was agreed. The single Swarm ship was isolated in a containment field, and the genetic modification agent was deployed. Human and Coalition scientists monitored the results with instruments sensitive enough to detect changes at the cellular level. The transformation took 36 hours. The Swarm organisms aboard the ship underwent massive biological changes as the viral agent rewrote key sections of their genetic code. It was a painful process, one that the monitoring equipment suggested caused significant distress. Several organisms died during the transition, unable to adapt to the rapid changes. But 23 organisms survived. When the process was complete, they were measurably different. Their pheromone communication patterns had changed, their behavior was less aggressive, and most significantly, the neural scans suggested increased individual consciousness. They were still Swarm organisms, still biologically driven, but the overwhelming imperative to expand and consume had been replaced with a more balanced set of instincts focused on community maintenance and sustainable resource management. The lead researcher, a Coalition named Doctor, presented the findings to the command staff. It worked. Not perfectly, we lost some subjects, but the survivors show exactly the changes we hoped for. They retain memories, identity, and consciousness, but they're no longer driven to aggressive expansion. They're content to exist in defined boundaries. Can they communicate? Asked. Better than before. The modification enhanced the neural complexity of the survivors. They're more capable of individual thought and communication. One of them has even been attempting to use the communication device to contact us. Let them through, ordered. The communication that came through was halting and crude, but unmistakably intelligent. Changed, different, no hunger, no need to spread, understand now, understand what we were, understand what we did, sorry, so sorry. The simple message carried an emotional weight that silenced everyone who heard it. This swarm organism, transformed by genetic modification, had achieved enough individual consciousness to understand what their species had done, to feel remorse for it, and to express that remorse. It was proof that sentience existed within the swarm, trapped beneath biological programming that it couldn't resist until now. Captain Park, who had spent years fighting the swarm, studied the communication with tears in his eyes. They were enslaved by their own biology. We've been killing prisoners who couldn't stop themselves from attacking us. And now we can free them, said quietly. If they'll accept it, we need to communicate with the rest of the swarm, let them know what happened to this ship, give them the choice to accept the same transformation. The transformed swarm organisms became unexpected ambassadors, communicating with the main swarm population in ways the coalition couldn't. They explained what had happened, what they now understood, what choice was being offered. It wasn't easy. The vast majority of swarm organisms were still driven by biological programming that made surrender and change incomprehensible. But the sentient individuals, few though they were, could reach others like themselves. Over the next week, more swarm ships approached under flags of peaceful intent, requesting transformation. Each time, the process was carried out carefully, with monitoring and support to minimize deaths during the transition. Each successful transformation created more ambassadors who could reach into the swarm population and find others capable of understanding the choice being offered. It was a slow process, far slower than a military victory would have been. But it was also something unprecedented, an attempt to end a war not through conquest or extermination, but through fundamental change that allowed both sides to survive. Not all of the swarm accepted. Thousands of bioships, driven by instincts they couldn't overcome, attempted to break through the blockade and resume hostilities. These were destroyed, sadly but necessarily. The genetic modification only worked on those who could accept it, who had enough individual consciousness to choose transformation. For the rest, there was no salvation, only the tragic inevitability of conflict with an enemy that couldn't stop itself. 6 months after the first contact with the modified swarm ship, the war effectively ended. Not with a dramatic final battle, but with the gradual transformation of the swarm population. Approximately 40% had accepted modification and survived the process. 30% had been destroyed attempting to fight. The remaining 30%, mostly non-sentient drones and organisms too primitive for the modification to work, were contained in designated zones under coalition supervision. The modified swarm, calling themselves the Awakened, established a new society in their home system under coalition oversight. They retained their biological nature, their hive-based social structure, and their efficient resource management, but without the overwhelming drive to expand and consume. They were content to exist within defined boundaries, trading with the coalition and slowly rebuilding a civilization that had never existed before. It wasn't a perfect solution. Many coalition citizens, by years of war, couldn't accept the swarm's continued existence, even in modified form. Others viewed the genetic modification as a crime worse than extermination, the forcible rewriting of an entire species' nature. The debate over whether the coalition had done the right thing would continue for generations. But they had survived. Both species had survived, and in the process they had found a third option between becoming monsters and becoming extinct. Commander, now Chancellor, stood in the newly reconstructed council chambers on Nexus Station, addressing representatives from across the coalition. She was older now, her crystalline skin bearing marks from years of stress and difficult decisions. Around her sat leaders representing not just the coalition species, but also the awakened swarm, participating for the first time in galactic governance. "We changed," she said, her voice carrying throughout the chamber. "The war forced us to become something we never wanted to be. We learned to fight like humans, ruthlessly, efficiently, without the restraints we once considered sacred. We used weapons of mass destruction. We contemplated genocide. We rewrote another species' genetic code without their full consent. These are not things we should be proud of." She paused, looking at the assembled representatives. "But we also survived. We found a way to end a war without completely abandoning our principles. Yes, we bent them. Yes, we stretched them almost to breaking. But in the end, we found a solution that preserved life, that gave even our enemies a chance to become something more. That's worth something." She gestured to the awakened representatives. Our guests today represent proof that even in war, even in desperation, there can be choices beyond simple destruction. The swarm that attacked us no longer exists, but the beings that they could become, the consciousness that was trapped beneath biological programming, has been freed. We didn't grant mercy. We didn't grant peace. We granted the possibility of both. Watching from the observer's gallery, felt the weight of years finally begin to lift from his shoulders. The coalition had learned his lessons, had embraced his methods, but they had also found a way to remain themselves. They had become survivors without becoming monsters. It was more than he had hoped for when he first arrived at their command station years ago. After the session found him in a quiet corner of the station, looking out at the stars. "You're leaving again," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah," confirmed. "My work here is done. You don't need an old human teaching you how to fight anymore. You've learned everything I can teach, and you found your own way to apply those lessons. That's all I could ask for." "Will we ever see each other again?" Smiled, the expression softening the hard lines of his face. "Maybe. If you're lucky, you won't need to. If you're unlucky, I'll be back, teaching you lessons you wish you didn't need to learn. But honestly, I think you'll be fine. You've proven you can make the hard choices without losing yourself in the process. That's rarer than you know." As transport departed Nexus Station for the final time, heading back to human space and the retirement he had earned several times over, he reflected on what he had witnessed. The Coalition had faced their crucible and emerged transformed, but intact. They had learned that survival sometimes required becoming something you didn't want to be, but that the choice of what you became was still yours to make. Years later, historians would debate the Coalition's transformation during the Swarm War. Some called it the loss of innocence, the moment when the galactic community abandoned the principles that had guided them for. Others called it the Great Awakening, when the Coalition finally accepted the harsh realities of existence and matured from idealistic youth to pragmatic adulthood. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in between. The Coalition had changed, irrevocably and profoundly. They could never return to the naive certainty that civilized warfare could solve all conflicts. But they had also proven that even in transformation, even in accepting harsh realities, they could maintain a moral compass. They could learn to fight like humans while remaining themselves. The Accords were rewritten, incorporating exceptions for existential threats and acknowledging that sometimes survival required flexibility. But the core principles remained. Minimize civilian casualties, seek alternatives to total war, never use force as the first option, and always remember that the goal is peace, not victory. The Human Systems Alliance, having guided the Coalition through their darkest period, maintained strong ties with their galactic neighbors. Human officers continued serving as advisors and teachers, sharing centuries of hard-won military wisdom. But they were careful never to push the Coalition further than necessary, never to make them more like humanity than they needed to be. Commodore, now promoted to Admiral and serving as Coalition Fleet Commander, stood on the bridge of her flagship 5 years after the war's end. Beside her stood Captain Park, her executive officer and closest friend. Together, they watched a training exercise where young Coalition officers practiced the tactics that had once seemed so alien and disturbing. "Do you think we did the right thing?" asked quietly. "Learning to fight the way humans fight, changing who we were." Park considered the question carefully. "I think you survived. Everything else is details. The Coalition still exists, the awakened have a chance at their own civilization, and billions of people are alive who would have died if you'd stuck to the old ways. If that's not the right thing, I don't know what is." "But at what cost?" "At the cost of innocence," Park admitted. "But innocence is cheap. It's easy to be innocent when you've never faced a real threat. What you have now is something more valuable: experience, wisdom, and the knowledge that you can face the worst the universe has to offer and still remain true to your core values." Watch the training exercise continue, seeing young officers from a dozen species working together, learning tactics that once would have been unthinkable. They were different from the generation that had started the war, harder and more realistic. But they still fought for the same reasons: to protect their homes, their families, their civilization. The methods had changed, but the purpose remained the same. In human space, finally retired to a small colony world on the edge of human territory. He spent his days writing, gardening, and trying to forget the sound of nuclear weapons vaporizing biological fleets. Some nights he succeeded, most nights he didn't. But he received regular communications from Coalition space. updates on how his former students were progressing, reports of successful conflicts resolved with minimal casualties, stories of the awakened integrating into galactic society. Each message reminded him that his teachings hadn't corrupted the coalition, but had given them the tools to survive while remaining who they were. On particularly difficult nights, when the memories of all the wars he had fought and all the violence he had taught pressed too heavily, he would read these messages and find some measure of peace. He had helped save a civilization. He had taught them how to survive without teaching them how to become monsters. It wasn't redemption exactly, but it was something. The galaxy moved forward, forever changed by the swarm war but still recognizable as the place it had been. The coalition maintained their principles where they could and bent them where they must. The awakened built a new society free from the biological imperatives that had once driven them to conquest. And humanity remained on the edge, ready to offer help when needed but content to let others find their own paths. It wasn't a perfect ending. Wars don't have perfect endings. But it was an ending where everyone lived, where civilizations survived, where hard choices led to outcomes worth the cost. And sometimes, in the harsh reality of the universe, that's the best anyone can hope for. The old soldier's warning had been simple: no more civilized war when facing bugs that didn't quit. The coalition had learned that lesson, had internalized it, had transformed because of it. But they had also learned something humanity had taken centuries to understand: that becoming what you need to be to survive doesn't mean abandoning what you were. It means growing, adapting, finding new ways to uphold old values in a universe that doesn't care about your principles. They had learned to fight like humans, but they had remained themselves. And in the end, that made all the difference. Would be their safeguard, the thing that prevented them from becoming the monsters they had learned to fight like. It wasn't much, but it was something. And sometimes, in the darkness of total war, something was enough. "You're becoming survivors," replied. "That's the first step, everything else comes after." As the human fleets began their deployment, wondered if she had just saved her civilization or doomed it to become something it should never have been. The answer, she knew, would come soon enough abandon them. They would test his approach on a small scale, and if it worked, they would consider broader implementation. When informed of the decision, he didn't celebrate. He simply nodded and said, "Show me your frontline positions. We need to set a trap."